180-foot water jet ferry is rolling broadside into a 20-foot rogue wave on Lake Michigan. The captain is down with a failing pulse. The first mate is dead, and 209 souls are screaming in the dark. And the only person stepping forward to seize the water jet controls is a quiet, 13-year-old black girl, but as her fingers lock onto the helm, a wealthy passenger shoves past her, his face twisted in pure condescension.
Get your hands off that console, little girl. Where is your mother? People like you don't belong in this wheelhouse. You're going to get us all killed.
Entirely blind to the fact that she has spent 6 years mastering this exact vessel on a bridge simulator, the lake is demanding an answer to a life-or-death question. And the adults have no idea that this child is the only one who knows how to save them.
And the part that will stay with you is how a corrupt maritime system spent 50 years denying this girl's legendary grandmother a command because of her skin, only for the entire ship to be saved by the brilliant legacy she left behind in a handwritten notebook.
But to understand how a 13-year-old came to be the only soul on that ferry who could bring it home, you have to go back. Back before the wave. Back before the gale. Back before any of them had thought to learn her name to a second-floor flat on Pavone Street. In Benton Harbor, Michigan. 3 hours before the lake came for the North Star, the sun was not up. And Maya Ellison was. She had been up since 4-1-0. Because that was what she did on the days that counted. And this was the day that had counted for 2 years. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the room that had been her grandmother's sewing room, in the second-floor flat on Pavone Street that she shared with her grandfather. And she ran her departure check out loud into the dark. Generators online. Bus tie closed. Jet pumps primed. Bow thruster armed. Steering selected to helm. Her voice was low and even a metronome. The cadence of a person who had said these words so many times. They had stopped being words and become a kind of breathing. On the floor in front of her was a 2015 ThinkPad with a corner of the lid held on by a strip of hockey tape. And on its screen was the bridge of a fast catamaran. She had rebuilt console by console out of a free marine simulator and a stack of operators' manuals. She had read until the PDFs felt like home. A $6 gamepad, the rubber worn off the left stick. Sat balanced on her knee. She had taped a paper compass. Rose to the wall at eye level, so she could keep a heading in her head with her eyes off the screen. The way her grandmother had made her practice. Because, this, I said, the day the screen lies to you is the day you find out whether you ever really learned anything. Above the simulator, pinned to the plaster with 3 sewing pins, was a photocopied chart of the approach into Milwaukee Harbor. Folded at the breakwater gap, Maya had drawn a small star in pencil beside the North Gap when she was 9. And above the chart, slightly crooked because the frame had no proper hook, hung a photograph. A woman in a chief engineer's coveralls standing in an engine room with one hand on a railing and her chin up. Not smiling. Looking at the camera, the way you look at someone who has just asked you a foolish question. Odessa Ellison. Chief engineer. Then mate. Then. At 51. After 30 years of being told no, in 100 quiet ways and a few loud ones. One of the first black women ever to sign a master's license on the Great Lakes. Dead 4 years now. The woman who had raised the girl on the floor and taught her the lake before she taught her to ride a bike, and left her. When the cancer finally took the argument out of her. A notebook and a sentence. The sentence was this: the water does not care what they decide you are. The water only asks one question. And the question is, do you know what you are doing? Learn the answer. and you will never have to ask anyone's permission to be on it. In the kitchen, her grandfather was already at the stove. Samuel Ellison was 71 years old, and for 30 of those years, he had poured steel at the works in Burns Harbor until the works let half the town go. And now 3 mornings a week, he ran a buffer down the hallways of Benton Harbor High School before the children arrived. Because a man does not sit still, and because the medical bills from Dessa's last year had not finished arriving, he had worked the late shift the night before and come home at 1 in the morning. And he had gotten up at 5 to make his granddaughter eggs, because she was crossing a Great Lake today, and he was not going to send her across it on a gas station honey bun. 8, he said, when she came out of the sewing room with her duffel on one shoulder. You don't eat. You get seasick. I read about it. She had read about it too. She ate 2 eggs and a piece of toast, and because he set it down next to her plate without a word, and with the corner of his mouth doing the thing it did. Half a leftover sweet potato she had pretended the night before she did not want. On the counter sat a printed letter. I've gone soft at the folds from being read. Dear Ms. Ellison, it is our privilege to invite you to the Great Lakes Maritime Academy Summer Bridge Program for Young Mariners. She had won her place with an 800-word essay. The prompt had been, why does the water matter to you? She had not written about the water. She had written about her grandmother. And the title of the essay was, A Heading is a Promise You Make to People Who Are Trusting You to Get Them Home. The program was in Milwaukee. To get there, you drove 90 minutes north up the lakeshore to Muskegon in the dark. And you took the fast ferry across. 80 miles of open water in 2.5 hours. Maya had never been on open water in her life. She had been on the simulator for 6 years, and on her grandfather's cousin's 14-foot aluminum boat on the Paw Paw River, exactly twice. And that was the whole of it. Samuel drove her up in the Buick with the passenger window that only rolled down halfway. He was coming with her. He was not going to put a 13-year-old on a boat across Lake Michigan and drive home. And he had taken the 2 days off and packed a thermos and a paperback. And he intended to sit in the North Star's passenger cabin, drink his coffee, watch his granddaughter, watch the water she had spent her childhood loving from 100 miles away, and feel his wife sitting in the empty seat between them the whole way across. They reached Muskegon at the gray edge of dawn. At the terminal, in the wind coming off the harbor, he crouched down his knees, did not love it, and zipped her rain jacket up under her chin. Your grandmother, he started, and then he didn't finish it, because his voice was not going to make it, and they both knew what the end of the sentence was anyway. Maya nodded. She did not say anything back. She did not trust her own voice either. They were, in that one way, exactly the same person. She boarded with the other passengers down a covered gangway, and she was the smallest person in the line by a head and a half. In the forward cabin, a man named Gerald Crane watched her come aboard over the top of a phone he was not really reading. He was 56. He ran a logistics firm out of Chicago that he had built from a single warehouse, and he had been rebooked onto the morning fast ferry after the weather scrubbed the regional flight he had meant to take. And he was in a foul, expensive mood about it. His watch cost more than the Buick in the Muskegon lot. His coat had not wrinkled. Nothing about him had wrinkled in some time. When Maya passed his row, working her way aft toward the windows she had asked the agent for, he leaned a few degrees into the aisle, and he said, in the voice a certain kind of man uses on a child, he has decided, is a problem to be located, rather than a person to be met. You traveling by yourself. Sweetheart, where's your mother? Maya stopped. She held her duffel a little closer. She had been asked some version of this question her whole life. In stories, In the library. On the one school trip to the science center, where a docent had asked her 3 times if she was with a group. She had a way of answering it that gave nothing away and surrendered nothing. My grandfather's right up there. Sir, she said, and tipped her head toward the row where Samuel was settling his thermos into the seat-back net. He's proud of me. That's not what I asked you. It's what I've got. Sir, and she went and found her window. Gerald Crane sat back. He did not know what to do with that. So he did what men like him do with a thing they can't immediately price. He filed it under odd and went back to his phone. A deckhand came down the aisle a minute later, doing the safety walk, a young woman of about 24, sharp and tired. Name tag, reading J. Calderon. She got to Maya's row. Looked at the kid by the window with a duffel and a paperback called Heavy Weather Avoidance and Ship Handling with the library barcode still on the spine. And she slowed her speech down half a step. The way you do for a child you assume is younger than she is. Hi. Honey. You doing okay over here? You know where the life jackets are. They're under your seat. You want me to show you how the straps work? I've got it. Mom. Thank you. Maya had read the North Star's safety card, the way other kids read the back of a cereal box. Twice. Before the ferry left the dock. She knew there were 8 life rafts, 4 to a side, and that the muster stations were lettered A through D, and that the EPIRB was on the bridge bulkhead, port side. And she knew all of this, not because she was frightened, but because knowing where everything was simply who she had been raised to be. Jess Calderon gave her the life jacket demonstration. Anyway, Maya watched the whole thing politely and said, "Thank you a second time," and did not tell her she could have given the brief herself. The North Star was a 180-foot waterjet catamaran. Aluminum. The fast 34 knots in flat water built to cross the lake in 2.5 hours and turn around and do it again. She carried 210 passengers and a crew of 8 up on the bridge. 2 decks above the cabin where Maya was tucking her duffel under the seat in front of her with both hands. The captain was running the same departure check. The girl had whispered into the carpet of a sewing room in Benton Harbor an hour before. Captain Raymond Holt was 58, with 31 years on the lakes, the last 9 of them on this run. He had a daughter at Michigan State and a bad knee and a forecast on the screen in front of him that he did not love, but had decided he could beat. There was weather coming down out of Canada. There was always weather coming down out of Canada in November, but the models had it arriving over the Wisconsin shore in the early afternoon. And the North Star would be tied up in Milwaukee with coffee in everyone's hands 2 hours before the first serious wind. Holt had crossed ahead of worse. He keyed the radio and got his clearance and singled up the lines. His first mate that morning was Aaron Brandt, 41, who had a wife named Diana and a daughter who was 14 months old and had learned that week to clap, and who had a photo of the clapping taped inside his locker that he had shown to anyone on the crew who stood still for 4 seconds. Brandt thought the captain was cutting the weather a little close. He said so, the way a good mate says it once. Plainly, on the record, she's earlier than they're saying. Rye, the buoy off Sheboygan's already building. Holt looked at the model again and said they'd be in before it. Brandt null, and let it go. Because that is what a mate does after he has said his piece. And he made a note in the deck log of the time and the wind. Because that is also what a mate does. The North Star cleared the Muskegon breakwater at 6:52 inches the morning and turned her bows west toward Wisconsin. And for the first 40 minutes, the lake let everyone believe the models. In the cabin, Maya did a thing she had done 10,000 times in a sewing room, and never once on real water. She took out a thin spiral notebook of her own, her grandmother's logbook. The real one. How to hold a heading. was wrapped in a freezer bag in her duffel because it was the most valuable thing she owned, and you did not bring the original out into the salt air. This was her working copy, and she began to write numbers down the left margin in a clean, square hand. Course 270. Speed 31. Wind out of the SW. Maybe 15. Building. Swell on the port bow. Long. 2 feet. Building. She did not know why she wrote them. She had been writing them for 6 years. Every crossing in the simulator. Every time her grandmother had quizzed her. She had logged the numbers. And she did not know how to be on a moving vessel and not do it. Her grandmother had said once, watching her do it at 9 years old, "That right there's the whole job. Anybody can drive a boat in the sunshine. The job is noticing the one number that changed before it gets big enough to hurt somebody." Across the aisle, a woman named Pearl Jennings, 67, watched the girl write her columns and felt something move in her chest she could not have named. Pearl had spent 40 years as an ICU nurse at a hospital in Gary before her knees and the night shifts finished her. And she knew the look of a person taking inventory. She had worn that look at 1,000 bedsides. She had not expected to see it on a child on a ferry. She did not say anything. She just watched. The way you watch a thing, you suspect you will be glad later that you watched. Photos up. Gerald Crane was on the phone with Chicago, telling someone the rebooking had cost him the morning and that he wanted the Cleveland numbers by noon. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been right so many times that he had stopped checking, which is a different and more common thing. And on most days it cost no one anything. Up forward, near the bow where the ride was roughest, a man named Tyler Voss, 30, sat with his knee jumping and his jaw tight. He had done 2 tours and come home with a nervous system that no longer reliably told the difference between a closing door and a closing trap. He was crossing to see a brother he had not spoken to in 3 years. He had taken the boat because he could not, that morning, make himself get on the plane. He was already gripping the armrest harder than the gentle swell warranted, and the swell was about to stop being gentle. And in seat 4F, with his thermos and his paperback and his granddaughter, 4 rows back where he could keep one eye on her, Samuel Ellison watched the gray water slide past the window and let himself, for the first time in 4 years, I feel almost peaceful. Dessa would have loved this, he thought. Dessa would have walked straight up to that bridge and told the captain his trim was a ½ degree off and been right. He smiled at the window. Then he looked back at Maya, bent over her numbers, her grandmother's exact posture in a 13-year-old's body. And the smile cracked something open in him that he let stay open, because there was no one watching and the water was beautiful. And his wife had taught the child everything she knew 40 minutes out. The lake stopped pretending. It did not announce it. That is the thing nobody believes until they have been out there. The barometer on the bridge had been sliding for 20 minutes. 1/10 of an inch. Then 2/10. Then a number Holt did not like at all. And the long 2-foot swell on the port bow had quietly become a 4-foot swell. And then a confused 6. The period shortening. The tops beginning to feather white. The model had been wrong. The system out of Canada had not waited for the afternoon. It had its own ideas, and it had moved them up. And the North Star was now exactly where a fast, light, high-sided catamaran least wants to be 30 miles from the nearest shelter. On open water, with a building beam sea and a wind that had come up 40 degrees and 20 knots in the space of a single cup of a steelworker's coffee. Holt throttled back. You have to. In a catamaran. In a sea like that, the speed that makes her wonderful in flat water makes her dangerous when she starts launching off the back of a wave. And a hull that comes down wrong can pound hard enough to hurt the boat, and everyone standing in her. He brought her from 31 knots down to 18, then 12, and he came off his course 20 degrees, to put the seas more on the bow instead of the beam. And he keyed the cabin PA in the calm, flat voice. That is the first thing they teach you, and the last thing you lose. Folks, this is the captain. We've got some weather that came in a little earlier than forecast, so it's going to get bumpy for a while here. I need everybody in their seats with their belts on. Crew will be securing the cabin. Nothing to be alarmed about, this boat's built for it, but stay seated. Stay belted, and we'll ride it out together. In the cabin, Jess Calderon and another deckhand started down the aisles. Fast, now, telling people to sit, checking belts, latching the galley. The deck began to move under everyone in a way it had not before, a long roll to starboard. A hang, a roll back, a corkscrew at the end of it as a quartering sea caught the stern. A child somewhere aft started to cry. Tyler Voss's knee stopped jumping, and his hand went white on the armrest, and his breathing changed. Maya capped her pencil. She drew a single line under her last column, the way the logbook had taught her, and she looked up at the bulkhead monitor that showed the boat's heading and speed in white numbers on a blue field. And she watched the heading begin to wander in a way that a heading held by a competent captain does not wander. And a cold, clear, familiar quiet came down over her. The quiet of a girl who has run 10,000 emergencies in a sewing room and has just felt, in the soles of her feet, the first real one begin. She did not know it yet, but in about 90 seconds, she was going to be the only person left aboard the MV North Star who knew how to hold a heading. It came out of the gray on the port bow at 7:41 inches the morning, and afterward the people who survived it would all describe it the same way, which is the way people always describe the wave that nearly killed them. It did not look like a wave. It looked like the lake had decided to stand up, a rogue sea, the engineers would call it that later. In the report, an anomalous wave of approximately 22 feet, resulting from the constructive interference of two swell trains, but to the 209 people inside the North Star, it was simply a gray wall that rose up off the bow higher than the windows, hung there for a held breath, and fell on them, the bow buried. The whole forward third of the catamaran drove down into green water, and the cabin windows went black and then white with foam, and the boat shuddered from her bows to her stern. And then she did the thing Holt had spent the last 20 minutes steering to prevent the sea got under her. Slewed her, and threw her broadside on the bridge. The wave did 3 things in less than 4 seconds. It threw Captain Holt against the chart console hard enough to knock the wind out of him. And the shock of it, the fall, the cold, the sudden violence after 31 years of bringing everyone home reached into a heart that had been quietly narrowing for a decade. And squeezed. He went down clutching his left arm, and his face went the color of cold ash. And he did not get back up. It threw First Mate Aaron Brandt, who had unclipped from his chair to reach the radar overlay, clear across the wheelhouse. He hit the steel edge of the chart table with the back of his head, and he crumpled at its foot. And the deck log, with his careful note about the wind in it, slid off the table and landed open beside him, and 3 decks down. In the engine room, it flexed the hull enough to finish a job. A marginal weld had been starting for 2 seasons, and a seam in the port sea chest let go. And Lake Michigan began to come into the MV North Star through a crack the width of a finger, under pressure. Cold as January. The North Star lay over to starboard 20 degrees. 25. A roll steeper than any. She had taken all morning, hung there with her cabin floor become a hillside. And the only thing holding her from going further was the buoyancy, in her wide twin hulls, and the simple physics that had not yet been overcome. In the cabin, anything not belted down went to the low side. A coffee cup, a paperback, a man's phone. The cry from aft became a scream, and other voices joined it. Tyler Voss was on his feet before the boat had finished her roll, and he was not in 2024 anymore. He was somewhere with sand in it, and he was moving toward the nearest door because the nervous system that had kept him alive over there was telling him the only truth it knew, which was get out. 3 passengers got to him before he got to the side exit, and an exit in that sea would have killed him and let the cold lake in on all of them. A young man and an older woman, and, of all people, Gerald Crane, who had moved without deciding to. The way you grab a child near a stove. They got their arms around Tyler, and they held on. And the older woman, Pearl Jennings, put her face 6 inches from his and said, in the voice that had talked 100 terrified patients down off the ceiling of an ICU, "Soldier, soldier, look at me, not the door. Me. We are okay. You are okay. Sit down with me. Sit down with me right now." And something in the oldest part of Tyler heard the word soldier spoken, like an order by someone who meant it as a kindness. And he sat, shaking, and she held his hand and did not let go of it for an hour. And Maya Ellison unbuckled her belt. Maya, her grandfather's voice, sharp with fear. 4 rows up. He had been thrown against his own belt. And something had gone wrong in his side when the boat rolled a rib. 2 ribs. And he would find out later. And when he turned to reach for her, the pain folded him forward and white. Maya. Stay in your seat, Maya. Grandad. She was already in the aisle, one hand on a seat back, riding the roll the way her grandmother had taught her to ride a moving deck, knees soft, weight low. Never fight the boat. Move when she lets you. Grandad. The heading's wandering and nobody's correcting it. That means there's nobody at the helm. I have to go up. You are 13 years old. I know exactly how old I am. She said it gently. It was the same thing she had said to the man in the front row 2 hours ago. And it landed in her grandfather's chest, like a stone going into deep water. Because he heard, in her voice, his wife, Grandad, stay still. You're hurt. Let me go do the thing she taught me to do. And she went up the canting aisle toward the stairs to the bridge, the smallest person on the boat, while 200 adults held their belts and screamed and prayed. And not one of them tried to stop her, because in the chaos, she was the only thing moving that looked like it had somewhere to be. Jess Calderon met her at the bottom of the bridge stairs. The deckhand's face had gone past its training. She had pounded on the wheelhouse door and gotten nothing. And she had the override key in her hand, and her hand was shaking too hard to use it. She looked down and saw a child coming up the stairs toward her. And her training came back, just enough to be wrong. Honey, no, you can't be up here. Go back down. Go back, Miss Calderon. Maya kept her voice level, which took everything she had. The boat's been beamed to for almost a minute. Nobody's answering the door. That means nobody up there can answer the door. You have the override. Open it. Please. We don't have time for me to be a kid right now. Jess Calderon stared at her, somewhere underneath the panic. A part of her registered that the child had just diagnosed the situation faster and more correctly than she had. How? How old? 13. Open the door. She opened the door. Maya stepped past her into the wheelhouse. And the smell of it hit her first. Not sweet. The way the book about the airplane had described that other poison. but the cold iron smell of the lake itself, blown in spray through a cracked window seal. And under it, the sour smell of fear. She saw the two men on the deck. She saw the captain's gray face and the dark, terrible stillness of the mate. She had read about both of these things. She had never stood over them. She went to Captain Holt first, because the captain was the gray one, and gray meant the heart, and the heart meant minutes. She put 2 fingers against the side of his throat, in the soft place under the angle of the jaw, the way the logbook said on page 9, check for 10 seconds. Count them. Do not guess. And she counted to 10, with the deck heaving under her knees. And she felt faint and wrong and far too slow. Flutter. And then nothing. And then a flutter. He has a pulse, but it's failing. She said, loud, to the doorway, where Jess stood frozen. Ms. Calderon, I need the nurse. The woman in the blue coat, across from where I was sitting. Rof Oshim. She knew what she was doing with the soldier. Go get her, tell her cardiac go. Jess went. It was the first order Maya gave aboard the MV North Star. And it would not be the last. She went to the mate next. She moved Aaron Brandt's head with both hands, as gently as if he were sleeping. And she found the place under his jaw. And she counted to 10. And there was nothing there. And she counted again because her grandmother's voice in her head said, count again. You owe him the second count. And there was nothing. And she understood, in the cold, clear part of her that was holding the rest of her up, that the man with the photograph in his locker was gone, and that there was nothing on this boat that was going to change that, and that she did not have time to feel it yet. She stood up. She turned around. Pearl Jennings was coming through the door, hauling herself up the canting stairs with both hands on the rail. Blue coat soaked at the shoulders. And one, look at the captain's face, and she was on her knees beside him with the speed of 40 years. Cardiac arrest. Pearl said, not a question. Already lacing her fingers over his sternum. How long? Maybe 90 seconds. I felt a pulse. Then I didn't. Then I did. It's failing. Maya was already turning toward the helm. I have to take the boat. Where beam to? If we take another one like the last one on this beam, we roll over. I have to get her nose into it before the next set. Pearl Jennings looked up from the dying captain at the 13-year-old already climbing into the helm chair. And she did the single most important thing any adult did on that boat all morning. She believed her. Then take the boat. Baby, she said, and started compressions. I've got this one. You've got the other 200. Maya climbed into the helm chair. It was built for Captain Holt, who was 6 feet tall, and it was set too far back, and her sneakers swung 6 inches above the deck plates, and there was no time to find the adjustment. So she scooted forward to the very front lip of the seat and braced her left foot against the console base and hooked her right ankle around the chair pedestal so the rolls could not throw her. And she put both hands on the water jet controls, not a wheel, on this boat, but 2 throttle levers and a steering tiller that vectored the jets. The controls she had rebuilt in a sewing room out of a manual and a memory, and she felt, for 1/2 of 1 second, the enormous animal weight of the thing she was about to do. And that was the second a man chose to put his hand on her shoulder and try to pull her out of the chair. He had come up the bridge stairs behind the panic, the way frightened men in expensive coats sometimes do, going toward the front of a thing, because the back of it is where the dying is. It was the executive from the gangway, Gerald Crane, the one who had looked at her 4 hours earlier and asked where her mother was. He had the face of a man whose whole life had just been proven not to be in charge of anything. And when he came through the wheelhouse door, and saw 2 officers down on the deck plates and a 13-year-old black girl with both hands on the controls of a ship in a storm. Something in him that had nothing to do with the lake and everything to do with the shore came apart at the seams. "Get your hands off that console." His voice cracked up into a register he would be ashamed of for the rest of his life. Get off of it. You're a child. Where is your mother? People like you don't belong up here. You'll get us all. You'll get every one of us killed. Do you understand me? You cannot be back here. Get down." He got one hand on her arm. Maya Ellison did not turn around. She did not argue. She had no time and no interest. And 120 miles away, a woman who had been told to get off of things her whole life had already taught her grandchild exactly what that voice was worth in a storm, which was nothing less than nothing, because the water could not hear it. She kept her left hand on the tiller and set her right foot harder against the console base and said, "To the windshield," in a voice that did not rise. "Then everyone on this boat is going to die in about 90 seconds. Because there is nobody else who can do this. And you are using up the time." A sea lifted the bow and dropped it, and the whole wheelhouse groaned. "Sir, let go of my arm and sit down. Or stay and help. Those are the only 2 things you can do that matter." She still had not turned around. It was Pearl Jennings who ended it. Pearl on her knees, with the heels of her hands buried in a captain's chest, who looked up over her shoulder and put 30 years of intensive care authority into 6 words. "Take your hand off that girl." And there must have been something in the way a black woman, his own age, said it, kneeling over a dying man she was keeping alive with her own 2 arms while he stood there in his good coat helping no one, because Gerald Crane took his hand off Maya Ellison's arm, as if it had caught fire. He stepped back. For one long moment, he stood in the middle of the heaving wheelhouse, with his mouth open and nothing coming out of it. A man watching the floor of his own certainty drop away beneath him. Then he backed against the rear bulkhead and gripped a handrail and went quiet. And the next time he opened his mouth, 20 minutes later, it would be to read a radar range to the same girl, in a voice gone soft with shame, and to call her something he could not have imagined calling her when he came through that door. But that was 20 minutes away. For now, there was only the lake, and the wave already building off the bow, and the turn she had not yet made. Then she did what her grandmother had drilled into her for the day. "The screen lies and the deck heaves, and you are alone," she said, the problem out loud, in order so the fear would have to stand in line behind the facts. "Beam to the sea. Have to come bow on. Wind from the port quarter. Steerage is low because we're slow. If I turn too slow, we get caught broadside in the trough. If I turn too fast, I broach the other way." She breathed in, power and rudder together. Like she said, power and rudder. Into the wave. On the backside of this one. Now, she watched the sea. She had spent 6 years watching simulated seas roll toward simulated bows, and her grandmother had made her learn the one thing no manual teaches well, which is timing. You do not turn a vessel into a sea on the face of a wave. You turn her on the back of one. In the lull, in the breath, before the next. And you have to read the lull coming the way a kid reads the gap in traffic before she runs across Pavone Street. A crest passed under the port bow, and the boat rolled and hung. And in the hang, in the half-second of slack water on the back of it, Maya pushed the port throttle up and pulled the steering tiller hard to port and held it. And the North Star, sluggish, heavy, full of fear, began, slowly, to swing her bows up toward the weather. "Come on," Maya said, to 180 feet of aluminum and 209 lives. "Come up, come up, come up." The next sea was already building off the bow, she could see it. A gray shoulder rising, and it was going to be close. It was going to be a race between the boat's slow turn and the wave's fast arrival. And Maya did the thing that separated her. The thing nobody had ever thought to ask if she could do. She did not panic and she did not freeze. She added more power. Just enough. Watching the bow come. Watching the wave come. And the bow won the race by maybe 10 degrees. And the wave that would have caught them broadside and finished them caught them instead, 3/4 on the bow. And the North Star climbed it, groaning, bowed to the sky, and came down the back of it hard but upright. Hull slamming. Spray exploding past the windows. And she was, for the first time in 2 minutes, pointed the right way. Maya let out a breath she had been holding since the bottom of the stairs. "Okay," she said, to herself, to her grandmother, to the wheelhouse. "Okay, bow into it. Now hold it. Now we don't die while I figure out the rest. I keep stopping the tape right here." 13 years old. 2 fingers on a dying man's throat. A second man already gone on the deck behind her. And the kid doesn't scream and she doesn't freeze. She gets in line behind the facts and she takes the helm. I have folded under so much less than that in my own life. And this child has just turned a ferry into a wall of water with her ankle hooked around a chair so the lake can't throw her out of it. She reached for the radio. The VHF was overhead. And she knew this radio too. Because a radio is a radio, and her grandmother had drilled her on the calls until they were reflex. She found Channel 16, the distress and calling frequency. The one, her grandmother said, "You keep in your bones, because the day you need it, you will not have time to look it up." And she keyed the mic. And she steadied her own voice, the way you steady a hand that wants to shake. And she made the only call that matters. Mayday. 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 United States Coast Guard. Any station. This is the motor vessel, North Star. A breath. Both bridge officers are down. The captain is in cardiac arrest. The mate is deceased. I am a passenger. At the helm. I am 13 years old. I have 209 souls on board. We are taking water in the engine room, and I need a Coast Guard officer who can talk me into a harbor. Over. 31 miles away. At the Sector Lake, Michigan Command Center on the Milwaukee lakefront. A senior chief named Daryl Maddox had been about to refill a cup of coffee he had let go cold. He was 57 years old. He had 33 years in the Coast Guard. The last 11 of them on the watch floor in Milwaukee, and he was 4 months from a retirement. His wife had already started planning. He had heard 10,000 radio calls. He had heard panic, and he had heard pranks, and he had heard the particular flat calm of professionals in real trouble. And what came out of the overhead speaker now did not fit any box he had. It was a child's voice, and it had said souls on board. And it had said cardiac arrest and deceased, and it had reported a flooding casualty and a position by giving him a vessel he could already see. Faint and yellow. On the traffic display. Squawking nothing. Drifting in exactly the wrong place, in exactly the wrong sea. Maddox set the cold coffee down. He pulled the boom mic to his mouth, and he took 2 full seconds before he keyed it. Because 33 years had taught him that 2 seconds spent well at the start of a thing like this is worth more than the best sentence you can rush into one. Motor vessel. North Star. This is United States Coast Guard Sector Lake, Michigan. Senior Chief Maddox. I have you on my screen. I read you loud and clear. He kept his voice low and even. The voice his own chief had used on him in the Bering Sea 30 years ago. The voice that says, "I have been here before, and we are going to be all right." Say again your souls on board. And tell me your name. 209 souls, including me. Senior Chief. My name is Maya Ellison. Maya. Good name. Maya. How old did you say you were? A pause. And when the voice came back, it was a hair smaller. But only a hair. 13. Senior Chief. But I've got 6 years on a bridge simulator. And I know this class of boat. And my grandmother taught me the radio and the rules before she passed. I've got the bow into the seas and I'm holding a heading. I need vectors to the nearest harbor that can take us. And I need it before the captain dies. Daryl Maddox closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Pranksters do not report souls on board. Pranksters do not say the nearest harbor that can take us. Pranksters do not put the bow into the seas. He opened his eyes and he turned to the watchstander beside him. And he said the words that started the largest small boat and aircraft response. Sector Lake, Michigan had run in a decade. Sound the SAR alarm. Launch the 45 out of Milwaukee and the Hilo out of Air Station Traverse City. Get me the North Stars operating company on the line. Get me a cardiologist on a phone patch. And somebody find out who this child's grandmother was. And then he pulled the mic back. And he made his voice into the thing a frightened person needs most, which is a calm one. And he said, Maya Ellison, I read you. I have 33 years on this water, and I am not going anywhere. You are not driving this boat by yourself anymore. From right now, until your lines are on a dock, I am your second officer. We are going to do this together. And we are going to bring all 209 of them home. You confirm that for me. A breath on the line. The slam of a hull coming off a sea. And then, steadier than it had any right to be. Confirmed. Senior Chief, glad to have you aboard. In the helm chair, with her ankle hooked around the pedestal, and her grandmother's notebook weighted flat under a brass parallel rule, and a man she could not save lying still on the deck behind her. Maya Ellison held the bow into the lake and waited for her second officer to give her a heading, 120 miles away, in the second floor flat on Pavoni Street. The framed master's license of a woman who had been told no for 30 years hung crooked on a kitchen wall. And below it, on the stove that no one had lit, the morning's silence kept its own kind of watch. The first heading Maddox gave her was a gift disguised as a number. Maya. The closest harbor I can put a boat that size into in this weather is Milwaukee, your own destination. It's about 31 miles. Bearing 265. But I am not going to ask you to run 31 miles beam to. We are going to do this in 2 pieces. First piece. Hold what you've got. Bow into the seas. And let me bring help to you. There is a 4 or 5 foot response boat coming out of the Milwaukee station right now, and a helicopter spinning up. Your only job for the next few minutes is to keep that bow up and keep breathing. Can you do that? I can do that. Senior Chief. Good. Then while you do it, I want you to give me a damage report. Because you told me you're taking water, and I need to know how scared to be. And here's the thing about Maya Ellison that the man in the front row and the kind deckhand and the whole boat had missed. She did not know only how to steer. She knew the ship. Her grandmother had been a chief engineer before she was ever a captain. And Dessa Ellison did not raise a child to drive a boat. She did not understand. So Maya, holding the bow into a 40-knot gale, with her ankle hooked around a chair. It looked at the engine room monitoring panel to the right of the helm, the same panel she had rebuilt pixel by pixel in a sewing room, and she read it the way you read a face you have known your whole life. Senior Chief, I've got a flooding alarm on the port hull. Sea chest space. Bilge levels rising. The automatic pump's running, but the level's still coming up. So the pump's losing the race. port engine temp is starting to climb, which I think means the water's getting near it. If that engine floods, I lose half my power and most of my steerage. A breath. I need somebody in that engine room who knows pumps. I can't leave the helm, and I wouldn't know the manual valves anyway. Understood. Maya, is there anybody on that boat who's an engineer, a mechanic, anybody at all? And down in the cabin, hauling himself hand over hand up the aisle toward the bridge stairs, because he had felt the boat come bow up and known, the way only an old engineer knows, that somebody competent had taken hold of her. There was Hector Reyes. Hector was 64. He had spent 31 years in the engine rooms of Great Lakes freighters, the last 15 as a chief, and he had retired the spring before to a fishing boat and a grandson, and a quiet he was already tired of. And he was crossing to Milwaukee to look at a used outboard he did not need. He got to the bridge stairs at the same moment. Jess Calderon was coming down them to organize the cabin. And he said, "Who's flying this thing?" And Jess said, "A 13-year-old. And Hector Reyes said a word in Spanish his grandmother would not have liked, and went up the stairs. He took one look at the wheelhouse, the child in the chair, the nurse on her knees over the captain doing compressions, in the still shape under the window. And he did not waste a single second of anyone's time asking how this had happened. He said, "Engineer, 31 years. Tell me what you need." Maya did not turn around. She did not have time to be surprised that the help she had asked the radio for had simply walked up the stairs. "Sir, are you good with a fast cat's bilge system? Twin Jastrum pumps. Manual crossover." Hector Reyes felt something go still and bright in his chest. The way Pearl had felt it watching the girl write her columns. The way Samuel had felt it watching her ride the deck. "Babe," he said, "I've been good with those pumps since before your mama was born. Where am I going and what am I doing when I get there?" Port Hull. Sea chest space. Down the engine room ladder. Second watertight door. There's a hull seam letting go. I don't know how big. The auto pump's losing. I need the manual crossover open to put the starboard pump on the port bilge too. And I need eyes on that seam so you can tell me if it's getting worse. Because if it's getting worse, I have to change my whole plan. She finally glanced at him. 1 second. A 13-year-old's eyes in a wheelhouse full of grown men down on the deck. "And sir, be careful on the ladder. The rolls are bad. I can't come help you if you fall." Hector Reyes looked at the child for 1 second longer than he needed to. And then he went down into the dark and the cold and the rising water to do the work she had sent him to do. And as he climbed down the ladder, he was, to his own surprise, not afraid, because somewhere up above him, a kid who knew the difference between a Jastrum and a Framo pump was holding the bow into the lake. And a man who has spent his life in engine rooms knows that the boat is only ever as safe as the person who understands her. And for the first time all morning he believed the person at the helm understood her completely. The Coast Guard cardiologist came up on the phone patch at 758, and Pearl Jennings, 67, on her knees. 40 years of nights in her hands ran a cardiac arrest on the deck of a ferry in a gale with a doctor's voice in her ear and a 13-year-old steering over her head. And at 8:04, on the 4th cycle, under her hands, Captain Raymond Holt's heart took back the rhythm it had dropped. He did not wake up, but the gray went out of his face by a single degree, and Pearl found a thready pulse that stayed. And she sat back on her heels for 1 second and put the back of her wrist to her own forehead and said, "To no one, stay with me. Captain, the baby up there is doing her part. You do yours." Then she got the oxygen bottle off the bulkhead bracket and put the mask on him and kept her 2 fingers on his throat and did not move them for the next hour. That was the moment the math changed. Because a captain in cardiac arrest is a clock running out. And a captain with a pulse is a man who can make it to a hospital if the girl at the helm could get the boat to one. Maya, Maddox's voice. I'm hearing from your cabin that the captain's got a pulse back. That nurse just bought us time. Now here's the picture. And I'm going to give it to you straight. Because you've earned straight. The seas are running 18 to 22 feet. The wind's gusting 45 out of the southwest. You've got a flooding casualty and engineers working on right now. And the harbor entrance at Milwaukee in a southwest gale is the hardest piece of water on this whole lake. Because the swell stacks up on the breakwater and the gap between the breakwater lights is 250 feet of moving water with a stone wall on each side. You are going to have to thread that gap. In these seas, on your first day on open water, a pause. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's easy. I'm going to tell you that you can do it. And that I am going to be in your ear for every foot of it. You still with me? Maya was quiet for 3 seconds. She was quiet because she was running 5 problems at once. And her grandmother's logbook said, on page 22, when you have more problems than hands, name them out loud before you solve them. Because a named problem is half solved, and an unnamed one will sink you. So she keyed the mic. And she named them, Senior Chief. I count 5 problems. Tell me if I missed one. A breath. The slam of a hull. 1. I'm flooding. And I won't know if I have a boat under me until your engineer calls up from below. 2. I'm slow. Because I have to be slow in these seas. And slow means I'm losing steerage. And a water jet with no way on doesn't steer at all. 3. The wind's on my port quarter. So when I turn to run for the gap, it's going to try to throw my stern around and put me beam to in the worst possible place. 4. The harbor gap is 250 feet wide with stone on both sides and a following sea behind me. Which means when I make my run, I'll be surfing. And if I surf too fast, I broach and we go onto the breakwater. 5. And here her voice did the only thing it did all morning that gave her away. It dropped. Just slightly. I have never done this outside a simulator. And there are 209 people behind me. And one of them is my granddad. And he's hurt. The radio was silent for a moment. That's 5. Maddox said, you didn't miss one. And Maya, number 5 isn't a problem. Number 5 is the reason you're going to get it right. He let that sit. Now, let's solve them one at a time. First one's not yours. That's the engineer's. Let him work. Problems 2 through 4 are seamanship. And you've got 6 years of it. Problem 5 is heart. And I can hear from here that you've got more of that than anybody on my watch floor. Turn for Milwaukee when I tell you. Not before. I'm going to put the helo overhead and the 45 inches your wake. So you've got eyes on you the whole way in. You ready to go to work? Ready. Senior Chief. From the engine room. On the sound-powered phone. Hector Reyes's voice came up. Rough and steady helm engineer. Crossovers open. Both pumps on the port bilge now. And I think we're holding. Level's not dropping, but it stopped climbing. The seam's about 8 inches. I've got a wedge and a collision mat on it, and it's slowing the flow. But I'm not going to win down here. I'm just going to keep us floating long enough for you to get us somewhere. Don't you dare take all day. Hiya. Toppe. Hector. Thank you. Holding's all I need from you. It'll get us in. And then, because her grandmother had taught her that you say it while there's still time to mean it. You're keeping 200 people alive down there in the dark where nobody can see you. I see you. Stay safe. There was a silence on the engine room phone. Then Hector Reyes, a man who had spent 31 years invisible in the bottom of ships, said, "Okay, Okay, baby, go fly her, in a voice that had something in it, and went back to holding his wedge against the lake. Gerald Crane appeared in the wheelhouse doorway at 811. He had come up to be useful, and he did not. At first. No how. He was a man who had spent 30 years being the most important person in every room he entered. And he stood in the door of this one. A child at the helm. A nurse over a captain. A dead man under a blanket Jess had finally found for him, and he understood. All at once, and completely, that he was the least useful person present, and that the only thing his whole expensive life had prepared him to do here was get out of the way. So he said the only true and useful thing he had. I'm Gerald. I was a Coast Guard officer once. A long time ago. Before any of this. He gestured vaguely at the suit. The watch. The man he'd become. I can read instruments, and I can take orders. Tell me where to stand, and I won't move until you tell me to. What do you need? Maya glanced at him, the same man who had asked her 2 hours ago where her mother was, who had filed her under odd and gone back to his phone. And she did not have 1 second to spend on the irony of it. And so she did the most graceful thing, which was to simply take the help. Mr. Crane, stand at the radar. Right there. I can't take my eyes off the seas. Every 30 seconds. Read me the range and bearing to the Milwaukee Breakwater North Gap. The charts on the screen. The gaps marked. And watch for the Coast Guard boat coming up behind us. Tell me the second you see it. If anything on that screen changes fast. You say it loud. That's the whole job. Can you do it? Range and bearing to the North Gap. Every 30 seconds. Watch for the 45. Gerald Crane planted himself at the radar, like a man who had just been handed the most important assignment of his life. Which, it would turn out. Hey, Alt. Yes. Captain. I've got it. He called her Captain. He did not decide to. It just came out. The way the truth does. When a man finally sees a thing, he should have seen the first time. And from that moment, until the lines were on the dock, Gerald Crane, 56 years old, worth more than the boat called the 13-year-old in the helm chair captain, and meant it more than he had ever meant any word in his life. Range to the North Gap. 6 miles. Bearing 268. He said, "Thank you, Mr. Crane," said Maya, and held her bow into the lake, and waited for her second officer to turn her loose toward home. Maddox turned her for the gap at 826, and the next 22 minutes were the longest of 209 lives. Maya, the helos overhead. The 45's a quarter mile off your stern, and the seas have steadied enough that it's time. Come right slow to 110 relative, and that'll put you on the run for the gap, with the seas on your stern. The second she starts to swing, you catch it. You know how to catch it. Power and rudder. Bring her around. This was problem 3. The one Maya had named. The turn that put the wind on the quarter and tried to throw the stern. She waited for her lull, the way she had waited for the first one, reading the gray shoulders rising astern. And in the slack on the back of a sea, she eased the tiller and brought up the power on the inboard jet and walked the North Star's bows around slow. Slow, fighting the wind that grabbed at the stern and tried to keep turning her past where she wanted to stop, and she caught it. Exactly where she meant to, with a kick of opposite jet that her hands made before her mind had finished the thought, because 6 years of doing it in a sewing room had put it in her hands, and not just her head. The boat steadied on the run for the gap, with the great seas now lifting her from astern, and the ride changed, no longer climbing into walls of water but riding down their faces. The speed surging, as each crest passed under her. Faster, then slower, then faster. This was problem 4. The surfing, the thing that could broach her onto the breakwater. And here, in the last and worst piece of it, Maya Ellison did the thing her grandmother had spent 1,000 evenings teaching her. The thing no manual teaches and no simulator fully prepares you. For she managed the boat's speed down the wave faces with the throttles, easing off as each crest lifted the stern, and the boat tried to run away down the slope, adding power in the troughs, so she did not lose. The steerage, that was the only thing, keeping her off the stones, riding the throttles and the tiller together like a single instrument, calling her own numbers out loud, the way she had called them, every morning of her childhood, into the dark of a sewing room. Speed, 16. Easing, 14. Hold surfing now. Easing, 11 power in the trough, 14 gap dead ahead. Mr. Crane, range to the gap. Half a mile, 250 feet wide. Lights both sides. I can see the spray on the breakwater from here. Gerald Crane's voice cracked and held. She's lined up. Captain, you're lined up. Hold what you've got. The seas were stacking on the breakwater now, exactly as Maddox had warned, the swell hitting the stone wall and rebounding. The water between the lights, confused and white and savage. The 2 red and green lights on the ends of the breakwater arms swaying in Maya's vision as the boat rose and fell. The gap looked, from the helm chair, no wider than the door of the sewing room. On each side of it was a wall of stone that would open the North Star like a can. Maya. Maddox's voice. Low. Steady. The voice of every good teacher who has ever stood behind a frightened student and refused to take the controls. This is it. This is the whole thing. You ride one wave through that gap. You pick your wave, not the biggest, the steadiest, and you ride it straight up the middle, and you do not let the stern get away from you. Pick your wave and call it, and I'll be with you the whole way. Your grandmother is in your hands right now. Take her home. Maya watched the seas come. A big one passed, throwing white up the breakwater. Behind it, a steadier swell. Longer. Cleaner. The one, she felt it the way she had felt the gap in traffic on Pavone Street. The way her grandmother had taught her to feel it. In her stomach, and not her eyes. This one, she said, riding it now. Hold on. And she took the MV North Star into the North Gap of the Milwaukee breakwater on the back of a single chosen sea. Surfing down its face with the throttles easing under her right hand and the tiller dead steady under her left. The red light sliding past the port window close enough to see the rust on it. The green light to starboard. The stone walls, a boat length away on either side. The whole world, for 3 seconds, narrowed to a heading and a promise, and the stern tried, once, to get away from her as the rebounding sea caught it. And Maya caught it back with a kick of jet and a half degree of tiller, the way her hands knew how, and held the bows straight up the center of the gap, and then the walls were behind her. The seas died as if a door had closed. Inside the breakwater, in the lee of the stone, the water was a foot of harbor chop where 10 seconds before it had been a mountain range, and the MV North Star slid into the calm of the outer harbor of Milwaukee at 11 knots. Upright, whole, 209 souls inside her, and a 13-year-old in the helm chair with her ankle hooked around the pedestal and her grandmother's logbook weighted flat beneath a brass parallel rule. Holding a heading, she had drawn a pencil star beside when she was 9 years old. The harbor radio came alive. A new voice, The Coast Guard 45, 100 yards off her quarter. A young coxswain named Reina Portillo, who would tell this story for the rest of her life, said, in a voice that broke 3 words in, "North Star. Coast Guard 45. We have you inside. Welcome into Milwaukee. We've got everybody waiting for you. Just hold what you've got and follow us into the dock. You did it. Captain, you brought him home." Maya Ellison eased the throttles back, and the North Star slowed in the flat water. And for the first time, in 51 minutes, she let go of the breath she had been holding since she felt the heading wander from a seat in the cabin. Her hands, which had been perfectly still on the controls for the whole of it, began, now that there was nothing left for them to do, to shake. Her knees, when she finally unhooked her ankle from the pedestal, would not have held her weight. And that was all right, because there was nothing left for her knees to do either. Behind her, Pearl Jennings looked up from the captain's pulse with tears running down a face that had not cried at a bedside in 20 years. Gerald Crane stood at the radar with his hand over his mouth. Down in the engine room, Hector Reyes felt the boat go level and quiet and steady, and he let go of the wedge he had been holding against the lake for 40 minutes. And he sat down in 8 inches of cold water and laughed and cried at the same time. And in the cabin, 200 frightened people felt the seas vanish and the boat steady. And a sound went up from them that was not a cheer. Exactly. It was something older than a cheer, and a steel worker named Samuel Ellison, folded over 2 broken ribs in seat 4. I heard the people around him begin to understand who had been driving. Heard a stranger 2 rows up say they're saying it was a kid. A little girl. She took the helm, and Samuel Ellison put his face in his one good hand and said his dead wife's name out loud. Ons. In a voice nobody else could hear, Maya did one more thing before she let anyone help her down out of the chair. She keyed the radio. "Senior Chief Maddox. I'm here. Maya, I've been here the whole time. I'm going to be here a while longer. I'm inside the breakwater. Boat's upright. Flooding's controlled. Captain's got a pulse. 209 souls. Following the 45 to the dock now." Her voice was steady again. The way it is steady when the worst is over, and you have not yet let yourself feel any of it. "Thank you for being my second officer." There was a silence on the radio that went on a little too long for a busy watch floor. "Maya Ellison," Daryl Maddox said at last, and his voice was not entirely steady either. "It was the honor of 33 years. Now take her to the dock. We'll talk about your grandmother when you're tied up. I've got a feeling I knew her." The MV North Star tied up at the Milwaukee Ferry Terminal at 9:04 on the morning of November the 8th. 58 minutes after a rogue sea put her captain on the deck, 2 fireboats walked her in. There were 4 ambulances on the dock, and there would soon be 11. The first people up the gangway were paramedics, and the first person they reached was not the 13-year-old in the helm chair, because Maya Ellison would not leave the chair until she had handed the vessel to a licensed officer, and there was not one aboard who could stand. So she handed it to the Coast Guard, a boarding officer off the 45 Petty Officer Reina Portillo, 26 years old, who had come up the gangway expecting to find a grown crew in a bad situation, and had found instead a child with her ankle hooked around a pedestal and a dead woman's logbook flat under a brass rule came onto the bridge. And Maya looked at her and said, in the voice of someone reciting something she had practiced in her head on the way in, so she would not get it wrong, "Coast Guard, the helm is yours. 209 passengers. Crew of 8. 1 crew fatality. Captain, in cardiac arrest. Resuscitated. No pulse on his own. Yet they're working him. First mate is deceased. Flooding in the engine room is controlled but not stopped. My engineers holding a wedge in the seam. Steering and one jet are good. The other jet is fouled. I had the helm because there was nobody else. I have it logged. It's yours now. And Reina Portillo, who would make chief someday and would tell this story at every promotion she ever attended, put her hand on the back of the helm chair and said, "I've got it. Captain, you can stand down." And then, because the girl's knees had buckled when she finally let go of the tiller, the Coast Guard officer caught her under the arms and held her up. And that is how Maya Ellison left the bridge of the North Star, not walking, but held. The way you hold someone who has carried a thing too heavy for far too long and has only just now been allowed to set it down. Here is the part I have to tell you straight. Because the water does not lie. And neither will I. They could not save Aaron Brandt. He had been killed when the Rogue Sea threw him into the chart console, killed in the first 10 seconds. Before Maya ever reached the bridge. Before anyone could have done anything for him. He was 41 years old. He had a wife named Diana and a 14-month-old daughter named Nora. And he had been a first mate for 6 years, and a good one. And on the morning of the 8th of November, he did the last thing a good mate does, which is be standing at his post when the lake came for his ship. 209 people walked off the North Star that morning. Aaron Brandt did not. Any honest telling of this story has to carry his name out of the water too, because he is part of the cost of it. And the people who lived owe him a debt that no foundation and no scholarship and no plaque will ever fully pay. Captain Raymond Holt got his own heartbeat back at 9:41 in the back of an ambulance on the Milwaukee dock, 41 minutes after Pearl Jennings knelt on a pitching deck and put the heels of her hands on his sternum and refused to let him go. He woke up 4 days later in Froedtert Hospital with a scar down the middle of his chest and no memory of anything after the wave. The first thing he asked the nurse was how many he'd lost, when they told him one, and then told him the rest of it. The whole rest of it. The kid and the helm and the breakwater. Raymond Holt, 58 years old, 30 years, a mariner, turned his face to the wall of his hospital room and wept like a child. Because he had been the captain, and a captain knows exactly what it means that he was lying on his own deck, while a 13-year-old took his ship through the North Gap. Now, I want to slow this down for a moment, because this is the place where most channels would already be rolling the triumphant music. And there's going to be triumph, I promise you there is. It's coming. And you've earned it. And so has she. But not yet. Right now, there's a young widow in Muskegon who just got the worst phone call there is. Right now, there's a captain crying at a hospital wall. Right now, a 13-year-old is sitting in an emergency room hallway in a city she's never been to, in a borrowed Coast Guard jacket 3 sizes too big, waiting to find out if her grandfather's broken ribs punctured anything. And she has not said a single word to a single reporter, because nobody has thought to ask her yet whether she's okay. They asked her to save the boat. They didn't ask her that. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it. Samuel Ellison had 2 broken ribs and a cracked third and no internal bleeding, which, at 71, is the difference between a hard month and a funeral. He would not let them give him anything for the pain until he had seen Maya with his own eyes. And when they finally wheeled him past the curtained bay where she was sitting, he reached out his good hand, and she took it. And neither of them said anything at all. Because there was nothing that needed saying between a man and the girl he had raised who had just done the thing the whole rest of her life had been quietly preparing her to do. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. That was the entire conversation. It was enough. The story broke nationally by that evening. And it broke wrong, the way these stories do. The first headline said a passenger had landed the ferry. Then they said a teenager. It took 2 full days for anyone in the press to use her name. And when they finally did, Half of them spelled it wrong, and almost all of them led with the same 3 words. Poor. Black. Girl arranged in whatever order made the click land hardest. As if those 3 facts were the remarkable part. As if the remarkable part were not 6 years of mornings in a sewing room with a dead woman's logbook. But the maritime people knew better. The maritime people always know better. Because the water doesn't care about your headline either. Senior Chief Daryl Maddox drove to Benton Harbor 11 days later. On his own time. In his own truck. He had retired 4 days after the rescue. His 33 years were up. And he had stood his last watch on the worst and best morning of his career. And there was a kind of rightness in that which he did not try to explain to anyone. He came up the walk of the little house on Pavone Street with something under his arm wrapped in a chamois cloth. And when Maya opened the door, he stood there for a second looking at her. And then he looked past her, into the house. At the wall of the kitchen, he could see down the hall the wall with the framed paper on it, and his face did something complicated. That's her license. He said, "Isn't it? Master. Great Lakes. I can read it from here. You knew my grandmother." Maya said. It was not a question anymore. Daryl Maddox came inside and stood in front of the kitchen wall, the way a man stands in front of a thing, in a church. The license was issued in 1981. The name on it was Odessa May Ellison, and the senior chief stood and looked at it. And then he told Maya and Samuel a story that not even Samuel had ever heard in full. In 1977, Daryl Maddox was 19 years old and the lowest galley hand on a Great Lakes ore carrier. And he was the only black man aboard. And the mate above him made certain every single day that he understood he would never be anything more than the lowest galley hand on a Great Lakes ore carrier. And there was a licensed engineer on that ship, a black woman, which was a thing that simply did not exist in 1977, except that it was standing right there in front of him every day, proving that it did, and her name was Odessa Ellison. And one night, when she found the 19-year-old galley hand crying in the engine room because he was going to quit, "I'm going to go home. I'm going to let them win." She did not comfort him. That was not her way. She handed him a wrench and a worn-out training manual, and she said 7 words to him that he had carried for 49 years and would carry into his grave. The water doesn't care. Show it. You do. She drilled him in that engine room for 2 seasons. She wrote his recommendation to the Coast Guard when no officer aboard would put his name to a black galley hand's future. She signed the sea service letter that got Daryl Maddox his start. And then the seasons turned, and they sailed on different ships, and he lost track of her. The way you do. And he made a career out of the chance she handed him. 33 years of it. And he never got to tell her what it came to. "I heard you say her name on Channel 16. Maddox said. His voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it steady. "You said Ellison. And you said my grandmother's logbook. And you talked to that boat. The exact way she used to talk. Like the water was the only judge in the room, and everybody else could go to hell. And I thought, it can't be. And then you took her through that gap like she was standing behind you." He looked at Maya for a long moment. "She was standing behind you. I just got to be the one holding the radio." He unwrapped the chamois cloth. Inside was a pair of binoculars. Old, heavy, salt-pitted. The leather worn pale where a thumb had ridden for 3 decades. "These have been on every watch I ever stood. I want you to have them, not as a present. He searched for it as a relief. You're standing the watch now. A watch officer needs glasses." Maya took them. They were heavier than they looked. "I'm 13, she said. "I know exactly how old you are," said Daryl Maddox. So did she. When she handed me that wrench. Age is what they decide about you. It's not what you can do. He nodded at the license on the wall. She'd have told you the same thing. She probably did. She said the water doesn't care what they decide you are. Yeah, said the senior chief softly. That sounds like her. The gifts came the way the lake comes in November all at once. From every direction. Diana Brent came in December. This was the hardest one. And Maya had been dreading it. Because what do you say to the wife of the man who died on the boat you saved? But Diana Brent had not come to be comforted, and she had not come to blame. She came holding a small box, and inside it was a brass deck officer's whistle on a worn lanyard. And beside it, Aaron Brandt's mate's license folded in oilcloth. He'd have wanted a mariner to have these. Diana said, "Not a museum. Not a drawer." She put the box in Maya's hands and closed the girl's fingers over it. "But you don't get to use the whistle yet. You hear me? Not till you've got your own license in your own name, and you've earned the right to put a thing in your mouth and have grown sailors jump when you blow it. He earned that. You will too. But you'll earn it. Then you blow his whistle." She held Maya's eyes. "Deal, deal." Maya whispered, "Good." Diana Brandt stood up. And at the door she stopped. And without turning around, she said, "He was at his post. When it came, they told me your grandfather told the investigators he was standing right where a mate's supposed to stand." Her voice held by a thread. "Thank you for being able to tell me that. You don't know what it's worth. To know he was at his post." Captain Raymond Holt came in February. Walking slow, with a new scar, and an old ferry captain's cap in his hand. His own. The one he'd been wearing when the lake took him down. He put it on the kitchen table. "I can't give you a license," he said. "Coast Guard gives those, and you'll get yours the regular way. The hard way. And you should. But I can tell you that the day you sit for your master's exam, I will be in that building, and I will buy you the worst cup of coffee in the harbor afterward. And when you pass it, I'm going to put you on my bridge as third mate myself." He pushed the cap an inch toward her. "That's not a present either. That's a reservation." Gerald Crane came in March, and Gerald Crane had done his homework. He was the executive who, on the morning of November the 8th, had looked at a 13-year-old girl boarding a ferry alone and asked her where her mother was. He had spent the storm at a radar set calling out ranges to that same girl and learning, in the space of 40 minutes, exactly how wrong a man can be about a person in the time it takes to glance at them and decide he had been, by his own account, the kind of man who knew the value of everything and the cost of nothing. And the lake had recalculated him. He did not bring a gift. He brought papers. The Odessa Ellison Maritime Foundation was incorporated in the state of Michigan on the 1st of March. It was funded, to start, with $2.5 million of Gerald Crane's own money. And it had one purpose: to put Marine Bridge simulators, real ones. The kind academies use. Not a 15-year-old laptop and a $9 gamepad into community centers and libraries and after-school programs in the kind of places nobody builds anything. Benton Harbor and Gary and Flint and the south side of every lake city there is. And it paid for the licenses. Any kid who came up through an Ellison Foundation simulator and wanted to go to sea, the foundation paid their way through the academy. All of it. And stood their bond. And found them their first berth. "You won't run it," Crane told Maya. "You're 13. You're going to be busy growing up and going to sea. But it's got your grandmother's name on it because your grandmother is the reason it exists, even though she's been gone 6 years. Because she taught a girl in a sewing room, and that girl took 209 people through a breakwater. And a man who should have known better watched her do it." He was quiet a moment. I asked you where your mother was. I want you to know. I know what I asked. I think about it every day. This is he gestured at the papers. Helplessly. This is me, trying to ask a better question for the rest of my life. And Hector Reyes, who had stood in 8 inches of cold lake water for 40 minutes, holding a wooden wedge against the side of a sinking ship and calling a 13-year-old Hija over a sound-powered phone, came up from Indiana one Saturday in April with his son's pickup truck full of parts. He spent the whole weekend in the spare room of the house on Pavone Street. And when he left, Maya Ellison had a real bridge simulator, 3 screens, a proper steering console, a throttle quadrant. He'd machined the brackets for himself, built into the room where her grandmother's sewing machine used to sit. Now you practice on something that fights back a little better than that laptop, he said, hugging her hard enough that Samuel winced on her behalf. And when you sit your exam, Mia, you call me. I will be there with Captain Holt drinking the bad coffee. We will all be there. You are not by yourself anymore. You understand. You did the worst of it by yourself. You don't have to do the rest of it by yourself. But here is the part that matters most. And it is the part the original telling of a story like this almost always forgets. And I will not forget it. Because it is the whole reason I go back into the water in the first place. The boat got saved on the morning of November the 8th. But that is only half the rescue. The other half took longer. And it was owed to a woman who had been dead for 6 years and wronged for the 50 before that. Because here is what they did to Odessa Ellison while she was alive. They made her sit for her chief engineer's license 3 times, failing her twice on oral exams that white men with worse answers passed on the first try. They gave her the engine room but not the bridge. For 11 years. Because a black woman could be trusted to keep the engines turning in the dark below the waterline, but not, God forbid, to be seen, standing watch where the world could look up and see who was driving. When she finally sat for her master's license in 1981 and passed it cold, they gave her the paper, and then they made sure she never got a command to go with it. 30 years, she sailed with a master's ticket in her sea bag, and they never once gave her a ship of her own. She retired in 2008 as a chief mate, the highest a black woman of her generation was permitted to climb on those lakes, with a master's license that the industry had spent her entire career making certain was only ever a piece of paper on a wall. That was the injustice. It was not loud. Nobody burned a cross on Odessa Ellison's lawn. They just quietly, politely, decade after decade, made sure that the most qualified mariner in a lot of the rooms she stood in would never be called captain. And then she died. In 2020. In the front bedroom of the house on Pavone Street, with the title she had earned and been denied. And the world moved on. And that should have been the end of it, except her granddaughter took a ship through the North Gap of the Milwaukee Breakwater. And people started asking where a 13-year-old learned to do that. And the answer led them straight back to a logbook called How to Hold a Heading and a framed license on a kitchen wall and a name. Nobody in the maritime establishment had ever bothered to honor, so they honored it. Not as charity. As correction, in the autumn of the following year, the Great Lakes Marine Hall of Fame inducted Odessa May Ellison posthumously, by unanimous vote. 41 years after she earned the license, that should have put her name in contention the first time. The citation, when they read it aloud, did not pretend. It named what had been done to her. It said, in the plain language the maritime people use, that Captain Ellison had been denied command her entire career for reasons that had nothing to do with the water and everything to do with the men ashore, and that the body was correcting, as far as the dead can be made whole, an injustice it should never have permitted. They used the word captain They used it 11 times. Maya counted, and the shipping company that owned the North Star. When they commissioned a new training vessel 2 years later, a real ship, a working ship, the kind cadets learned the lakes aboard. They named her the Odessa Ellison. There is a black woman's name on the bow of a Great Lakes ship now, in white letters 6 feet tall. And every cadet who sails her learns who she was and what was done to her, and what her granddaughter did on a November morning to finally make the world say her name. The first vessel, Odessa Ellison, was ever permitted to command. She commanded 40 years too late, and from beyond the grave. But she commands it. Her name is on the bow. The water reads it every day. Stay with me one more time, and then I'll let you go. You see what happened there? They didn't just give a brave kid a scholarship and roll the credits. That's the version everybody else makes. And it's a lie of omission, because it lets the system off the hook. It says one exceptional child overcame, and it never asks why she had to. This story asked. The maritime people asked. They looked at what they'd done to her grandmother. The failed exams that weren't failures. The engine room instead of the bridge. The master's license they turned into wallpaper. The 30 years of not yet. Not you. And they didn't paper over it with a foundation and a photo op. They named it out loud in a Hall of Fame citation, and they put her name on the bow of a ship. That's the difference between a reward and a reckoning. A reward says thank you. A reckoning says we were wrong. And here's the proof. In 6-foot letters, where the whole lake can see it. Maya didn't just save a boat. She made them say her grandmother's name correctly. 40 years after, they made sure to get it wrong. Maya Ellison went back to sea. In the end, the regular way. The hard way. The way she wanted. She finished the 8th grade. She finished high school in Benton Harbor. And she spent 4 summers as a deckhand, a real one. The lowest one. Chipping paint and tying lines and being told to go sit down by mates who didn't know yet who she was. And she went and sat down every time. Because Odessa Ellison's granddaughter knew the difference between a watch you've earned and a watch you've only survived. She went to the Great Lakes Maritime Academy on a full ride that the school offered her the week after the rescue, and that she made them hold for 5 years until she'd earned her place in the ordinary way. She sat her exams. Hector came. Captain Holt came. They drank the bad coffee, and the night she passed her third mate's license her own. In her own name. The paper that says the world will now call her Officer Maya Ellison, sat down at the kitchen table in the house on Pavone Street, under the framed license that read Odessa May Ellison, Master, Great Lakes. And she took out a brass whistle on a worn lanyard. And for the first time since a widow had closed her fingers over it, she put it to her lips and blew it. One long, clean note. In an empty kitchen. For a man who had been at his post. Then she opened a logbook. Not her grandmother's, her own. A new one. The first page blank. And in the careful hand of a girl who had been taught that a logbook is a promise you make to the people who come after you, she wrote, M. Ellison, 3rd mate, Great Lakes. The watch is mine now. I will hold the heading. On the wall. The license. On the table. The binoculars. The whistle. A worn captain's cap. Abras para el rule. And a small carved wooden tug that a woman had whittled for a granddaughter who wasn't born yet. On the bow of a training ship, 200 miles north. 6-foot letters in the dark. And out past Benton Harbor. Out past the breakwater. The same lake that had tried to take 209 souls and been refused by a child with steady hands flat now. And black. And patient. going on forever toward a horizon that did not care what anyone had ever decided she was, and never had, and was the only judge that had ever told her the truth. So here is where I leave you. The way I always do. We go back for the people, the headlines left in the water, the ones nobody thought to ask. They asked Maya Ellison to save a boat before they ever asked her name. So I'll ask you. The way I always do, who in your life is holding a heading nobody's bothered to notice, whose name has the world been getting wrong, go ask them. Then come back and tell me about it. That's why the comments are there. If this one moved you, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay in the water with us. There's always somebody out there still holding on. We're going back for the next one.